everyone, welcome to the Preakness edition of the TimeformUS Forecast. As my usual co-host Craig Milkowski and I will take a look at the second jewel of the Triple Crown, but we're going to get to that in the second half of this podcast. We're sort of going to make this a little bit of a hybrid pacecast forecast, as this is the only podcast that we'll be putting out this week. And we'll begin by looking back at some races from last weekend. Really, most of the major racing did take place at Belmont Park on Saturday, so let's discuss a few of the stakes races from there. And Craig, there were 3 graded stakes. They all earned some decent speed figures. I think the Grade 1 Man of War was the feature, but a lot of eyes also were on that Grade 3 Peter Pan, which may or may not serve as a prep for the Belmont Stakes. I think it remains to be seen, but some nice performances in New York on Saturday.
Yeah, there were. They were kind of spread out on the card a little bit, with a gap in between that and the Run Happy, the Man of War and the Peter Pan, then the Run Happy. But yeah, I thought there were some good efforts. Obviously, the Man of War came back strong, a Grade 1 for older males. But the Peter Pan, I haven't heard who's pointing there, but who would be pointing to the Belmont. But I was certainly impressed with both of the top 2 finishers.
Yeah, let's talk about the Man of War first. As you said, that was chronologically the first one that they ran on Saturday at Belmont Park, squeezing these graded stakes in early. And pretty rare thing to see, especially in this day and age, a 9-year-old horse winning a Grade 1 race. I was kind of, opening up the floor on Twitter to see if anybody else could name other horses in that age group that had won Grade 1 races. And, people obviously brought up John Henry and also John's Call, who, of course, has a race named after him at Saratoga. But not too many horses in that 9-year-old plus category that are Grade 1 winners. And Red Knight, he became one on Saturday. Not the toughest edition of the Man of War that we're ever going to see, and not the strongest Grade 1 race, but still a pretty cool feat by a horse that has been around for a long time.
Yeah, he's been around a long time, and he almost always shows up and runs his race. I mean, his Breeders' Cup didn't go very well this year, but I think he had some excuses, and he's come back at 9 as strong as ever, winning a Grade 3, narrowly missing in the Grade 2 Elkhorn, and then getting up to win the Man of War. And just, I've really grown to love these older turf horses. It helps in his case that he's a gelding, but even when they're not, they just seem to stick around a while, and when they get good, they tend to stay good, and he's just a warrior.
Yeah, I remember this horse started out in Bill Mott's barn, was with him for a long time, I think all the way up until 2021. He had begun his racing career, I think, in an off-the-turf race at Belmont back in 2017 when he was a 3-year-old. And, he's had some dips in his form over the years, but just always comes back and seems better than ever. And seemed to get a new lease on life when he was transferred to Mike Maker at the beginning of 2022. And seems to continue to hold that form here. Got another good trip and ride from Irad Ortiz in this spot, and just I think had the resume and the experience to win a race like this, especially when the horse that took all the money that Charlie Appleby's shipper for Godolphin, Warren Point, just didn't seem to get the trip that he really needed to be successful here. But also a horse that probably was a little overrated. And I did another podcast last week and we were talking about this quite a bit. That at some point these Charlie Appleby Godolphin horses are going to start to be underlays because people are just going to assume that they're going to win everything. And they brought over a horse that on paper didn't have some huge class edge over this field. And when the trip didn't go perfectly, he wasn't able to get it done.
Yeah, he didn't look overwhelming on paper like some of the Charlie Applebys. We've already seen him lose once this year with Modern Games at a very short price. So yeah, like you said, his horses are going to come, they're going to show up and run, but at some point the public just goes too far and overbets these horses, and this one didn't look like 3-5 on paper to me. I know Andy Serling, I was watching the Fox show, made that point repeatedly that, it's just he didn't really have those kind of credentials. He ran okay. I mean, he was only beaten, I think, 1 3/4. Not the greatest trip, and it wouldn't surprise me if he actually won some Grade 1s in this country because he round up with a nice 120 speed figure, which will win some good turf races here in the U.S., but he was just way over bet, and Red Knight slipped through the cracks a little bit. He ran a 122, I should mention, which is pretty much his A race. When he runs one, that's about what he gets.
Yeah, and I will say I saw a lot of horse players were sort of confused and frustrated by the whole equipment accoutrements, I guess, that Warren Point was taking to the starting gate. I don't know how else to put that. The blanket, the hood, the blindfold, and that's what the connections wanted. Obviously, it's not like anybody was trying to sabotage his chances. They gave specific instructions for the horse to be handled that way, and I know it's very unusual in the U.S. to see a horse loaded into the gate with a blindfold and then have it be removed at the last second when the gates open. But over in Europe, you have to understand that a quick start isn't always desired, especially if you want to get a horse covered up. And they wanted to get this horse covered up. Obviously, didn't quite work that way. And say what you will about the trip after the start, but I mean, I don't think they were looking for this horse to break out of the gate like a shot and go to the front end. So I mean, that's just the way they wanted to handle him. And you see it a lot more if you watch European racing. The blindfold and the hood and the blanket, all of that. But I get that it was far into some of the U.S. race watchers, and I know some people were a little frustrated by the fact that this horse broke slowly with all of that. Just wanted to make mention of that. But yeah, aside from Red Knight, a real, bunched finish in behind, yet another very competitive, wide-open race in this division. And like you said, this has become a really fun division, this older turf division, because you see a lot of different horses winning, competitive racing. So I always look forward to these races. Let's move on to another graded stakes from that Belmont card, the Grade 3 Peter Pan, the very next race run on Saturday. This one going that 1-turn, 1.125 distance on the dirt course for the 3-year-olds. Like we said, remains to be seen if this is going to be a real prep for the Belmont Stakes. It seems like some of the connections, including those of the top 2 finishers, haven't really committed to a next start just yet, kind of leaving the door open. But Craig, we saw a nice battle here between 2 talented 3-year-olds in Arcangelo and Bishop's Bay, who drew almost 9 lengths clear of the rest of the field and really threw it down in the final eighth of a mile.
Yeah, it was quite the race. Really looking, coming off the turn, I thought Arcangelo was just going to run right by Bishop's Bay, but Bishop's Bay had demonstrated some gameness in his prior starts, and we saw it again as he fought him all the way to the wire. Wasn't quite able to get back on terms, but just a really good race by those two. It was almost 9 lengths back to third. Both the top 2 got a 1:17 Timeform US speed figure. The final time was 1:20. The pace was definitely on the moderate side, which favored Bishop's Bay a little bit, and I would say makes Arcangelo look even a little bit better, or he is a little bit better than what it looks from the finish.
Yeah, you could tell the connections were very confident. Javier Castellano, who's having a real resurgence, rode this horse with a ton of confidence, and they had a right to be confident, Craig. I mean, I know that you and some other speed figure makers had his last race very fast. I mean, it was one of those days at Gulfstream where there weren't a whole lot of dirt races to judge it off of, but it seemed like a very fast race against the clock, and he certainly validated that last out Timeform US speed figure by coming back to nearly repeat it here in the Peter Pan, actually running a little bit higher in terms of the final time number, which was a 1:20. And this is clearly a horse with a lot of talent. I know the last time we had talked about him on the Pacecast, I had mentioned that it was a little strange that he had only sold for $35,000 as a yearling, just given his awesome pedigree, being by Arrogate out of a Tappet mare from the family of horses like Jazzle and Rags to Riches, that Better Than Honor family, the same female family that produced that very expensive yearling Cezanne, who was a good horse for Bob Baffert, and just kind of strange that this one wouldn't sell for very much money, but might have not looked great at the sale. A lot of time has passed since then. Maybe he's got some confirmation problems, but he certainly can run in the afternoon, and I think that's what matters.
Yeah, no doubt. And I did want to mention Henry Q, who ran a decent but distant third. He was a horse who was coming out of that Sunland Derby, a race that I mentioned. It just came back so slow. It didn't make a lot of sense. I went with the time speed figure wise. The runner-up came back and ran pretty terribly, but 3 horses since then have ran much faster speed figures out of that race. One of them twice, a horse named One in Vermilion. So that's just a tricky race. So when you see horses running back out of that Sunland Derby, maybe view those low speed figures with some skepticism.
I think we'll talk a little bit more about One in Vermilion as a yardstick when we get to our Preakness handicapping, but that's a good point about him. And I just want to bring up one more thing, Craig. Bishop's Bay seems like a horse that has a little bit of hang in him. He definitely has a tendency to wait on horses, because watching this race, to me, it looked like he got himself beat, because Arcangelo came to him, like you said, like he was going to blow right by. And once Florent Geroux got into Bishop's Bay, he was really battling back down towards the inside and actually stuck his head back in front with about a 16th of a mile to go. But you could see every time he stuck his head in front, he would put his ears up forward like he was pulling himself up. And watching horses' ears is always really instructive in situations like that, whether they're giving a full effort or not. And you could just see this horse just was not totally focused on running, and unfortunately lost focus at a critical point in the race just as they came onto the finish line. And I think that was really decisive in terms of who won this race. But he's a really talented horse, obviously very lightly raced, as both of these are. I wouldn't be surprised if the connections of both Arcangelo and Bishop's Bay decide to bypass the Belmont Stakes. It could be asking a lot of horses in their fourth or fifth starts of their career to go the mile-and-a-half distance, but I've got to say both of them seem like they might be suited to it. Arcangelo certainly bred to run all day, and Bishop's Bay, he also has a pedigree to go long, and to me, even though he was so successful sprinting on debut, he seems like a horse that really is a strong finisher, and if they can finally get his mind on running, he's a horse that I personally would be very interested in the Belmont Stakes. I just am skeptical they'll actually go that route.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see who chooses it. Maybe it'll depend on the Preakness, who all's going to show up. They do have more time than they used to. I forget when the change was made. I remember when the Peter Pan used to always be run on Preakness Day, so it was only 3 weeks, but it's obviously now a month. So I hope one or both of them shows up in the Belmont, because it is, after all, still a Triple Crown race, but that is to be determined.
And the final graded stakes they ran on that Saturday card at Belmont was the Grade 3 Run Happy. Obviously, not the strongest sprint race that we're going to see in this division all year. It's a Grade 3 event, and it sort of played out like that. Candyman Rocket had run some nice races at Gulfstream Park. Really, almost all of his good races had come in Florida up until this point, but he was able to get this stakes victory here after working out a pretty nice outside stalking trip.
Yeah, he ran fine. He ran a 117 speed figure, as did the runner-up Twisted Ride, who took the lead. Couldn't hold him off, though. Candyman Rocket got it done pretty easily. The thing I took out of this race is he bounced back from that race where he just didn't show up at all, ran last in a race that Skelly won, a horse we've talked about, and just that horse has proven to be really strong. Horses who face him are in deep trouble, and maybe you can excuse some of those running lines at this point in time anyway.
Yeah, any race that Skelly is in is going to be pretty fast-paced, and Candyman Rocket was just badly outrun every step of the way in that prior race at Oaklawn, but much more comfortable trip, worked in his favor here. Like you said, Twisted Ride ran fine. I don't have a whole lot to say about the others in this field. I think that they'll be hard-pressed to make a significant impact on the major races in the sprint division moving forward, but the winner is okay. One more race I did want to discuss from this Belmont Park card on Saturday was the race right after the Run Happy. That was an N1X allowance race for the 3-year-old fillies going the mile and the 16th distance on the turf. And I think we saw some pretty nice 3-year-old fillies in action here, including the winner, Spansive, who was well meant on debut at Gulfstream when she won at odds of 2-1, beating a pretty good field as the runner-up Glorious Princess came back to very impressively break her maiden with a big speed figure next time out at at Churchill Downs, and also another horse coming out of that race, Prerequisite, came back and was a nice maiden winner at Belmont in her next start. So the form lines were strong for Spansive coming out of that Gulfstream race, and she took a step forward to beat this salty allowance field.
She did. She won with a 106 speed figure, upgraded a little because of how fast she finished. Actually, the runner-up, Juniper's Moon, I know a friend of the podcast, I guess we could say. We've both liked her a couple times when she's run well. Actually ran a little faster figure, and even though she was beaten a little over a length, I don't think that's out of the question that she was just as good as Spansive in here, given that Spansive had everything her own way, clear early lead, all the fractions are coded in blue. Don't get me wrong, she won the race, don't want to take too much away from her, but she did have everything go her way. So I'd be interested in the couple behind her, including even the third place finisher, Free Look, who was even further behind than Juniper's Moon and was passing horses in the stretch.
Yeah, I thought this was a solid race. I was honestly kind of dumbfounded that Spansiv went off at 6-1 in here. I thought she would vie for favoritism, but unsurprisingly, they've been, or I should say, maybe it was slightly surprising to me because my morning line was a little different than this. But they're just overbetting Irad Ortiz in every race in New York recently, and Get Your Kicks took a lot of money in this race, even though she hadn't really run any faster than Spansiv in their respective maiden victories. Spansiv's a nice horse. What you say about the pace is true. It seemed like she really had all the best of it on the front end, just like she did in her debut, but she digs in and finishes off these races, so she's at least one of these horses that doesn't get headstrong up front. She's certainly a strong finisher as well, and I agree about Juniper's Moon and Free Look. They both had been coming out of that Florida Oaks at Tampa Bay Downs, which I know you had given a very big speed figure to at the time, and I think that's proven to be correct because we've seen some nice runbacks out of there, including the winner of that race, Mission of Joy, who I had thought was a little unlucky when she lost the Edgewood in her next start. So definitely some horse that you can keep an eye on coming out of that Florida Oaks. Well, Craig, I think that's all we need to do for the recap portion of this podcast. There wasn't too much major stakes racing going on around the country last weekend. So we'll get to the portion of this podcast that I think most people are here to listen to, and that's our preview of the Preakness Stakes. It is race 13 on Saturday at Pimlico. Obviously the second jewel of the Triple Crown, going the mile and 3/16 distance on the dirt. And just like we did for the Derby, we'll go through this field in post-position order, kind of talking in depth about each of the 8 runners in this field, so I don't think it's going to take quite as long as our expansive Derby preview. But before we go through runner by runner, Craig, we should just talk a little bit about this race overall, how it came up in terms of maybe a lack of depth, and also how that's going to play into the pace situation. So I'll throw it to you for that.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. Obviously, we only have one horse from the Kentucky Derby. That's the winner, Mage. All the others are horses who were not either couldn't make the Derby or just weren't pointed there. I do think there are some decent horses in here. I wrote an article, which I assume will appear in the Daily Racing Form in Saturday's edition, about the pace of the Preakness this year. And I think it's a little bit sketchy. I don't think it's obvious who's going to be the front runner. We show Coffee with Chris, the 4-horse, on the lead, a little bit over the 1 National Treasure and the 8 First Mission. And if I had to make a pick of who I thought was going to lead, I would probably say Coffee with Chris. He's a horse who I'm not sure he really wants to go this far. He's shown high speed in a lot of shorter races, including sprints where he's been right up on the pace in red fraction. So that's why he's shown on the lead. He's probably the naturally fastest horse in the field as well. So I don't really have a big problem with the pace projector, but a couple of the others, maybe they would challenge a horse like National Treasure, who's putting blinkers back on. It seems to be a little game they play. I guess they can't figure this horse out, I should say, because he started his career with blinkers, took them off, put them back on, took them back off. Now he's putting them back on again. To me, that's not a great sign. He's a horse who hasn't shown all that much speed. I'm assuming drawing the inside post position with John Velasquez, he's going to try to go. I just don't know if he's really all that fast. And then we have the horse on the outside, First Mission, a horse who's been close up in all his races without leading early. I tend to think the pace projector has him spot on. There's no reason from his post to gun for the lead. I imagine his rider, Luis Saez, will see how things play out and probably sit off a horse or maybe even tuck back in third.
Yeah, I think I agree with most of that. It seems like the consensus out there is that National Treasure is going to be the early leader, but I agree. He hasn't shown that much early speed in prior races, aside from his debut race where he was wearing blinkers. So, I mean, if he can refine that gate speed, I guess he can get to the front here. But Coffee with Chris, just a naturally fast horse. Maybe the post positions are going to dictate those early positions at the first half mile, which is when the pace projector captures these horses. And Coffee with Chris having drawn outside of National Treasure, maybe that'll give the connections a reason to want to rate outside of that foe. Coffee with Chris has been successful from a stalking position before, as all of these horses have. There's really no confirmation confirmed frontrunner in this field. So we'll see how that all plays out. But however, whoever gets to the lead, I'm not anticipating this is going to be a race that is really going to be suited to a deep closer like the Kentucky Derby was. This feels like it's going to play out very differently than the Derby. So we'll see how that affects a horse like Mage, who obviously has more versatility than the way that he won the Derby. But I would imagine this pace is going to look very different than it did 2 weeks ago.
Yeah, and I was I won't say surprised. I was interested to see where Mage would be positioned on this pace projector, and I think him being tucked in a close fifth, right alongside the fourth horse, shows that it's not the fastest pace we're ever going to see in one of these Triple Crown races, given the way he's run his last couple. And I think that's actually a very good thing for Mage, that he probably won't be very far back. We've seen even though he won the Kentucky Derby from well off the pace, he's far from a plotter. He makes that big move on the turn, gets into contention before the stretch. So I don't think the pace is a big concern for him in this field.
And obviously, Craig, I mean, we have to point out the obvious, what's plainly apparent when you look at this field. It's disappointing that we just have one runner coming back from the Kentucky Derby. I think our colleague Dave Grenning looked back and figured out that it's the first Preakness stakes since they set the current Triple Crown schedule with 2 weeks between the Derby and the Preakness and 3 weeks between the Preakness and the Belmont. The first one since 1969 when that schedule came into place, where there will be only one horse from the Kentucky Derby running back in the Preakness. And that's just, something we've talked about ad nauseum, and I've stirred the pot a little bit on social media, as you pointed out yesterday, with suggesting the Triple Crown should be changed, and not that that's the most important thing that we have to do in racing right now, but just kind of stating that we want to see these races be competitive affairs, and it just feels like the Preakness has been getting less and less respect from horsemen, especially over the past decade. I mean, you could argue whether the trend was, going in that direction before that, but I mean, it's unmistakable that it's been heading in that direction in the past 10 years or so. And, if we want the Triple Crown to stay the way it is, I think we just have to accept the fact that the Preakness is not going to be the most competitive race, and we might have a lot more Triple Crown attempts. And, people sometimes will argue that the difficulty of running the Triple Crown isn't necessarily facing the toughest fields. It's being able to show up 3 times in 5 weeks. And obviously, that's the way that it's played out over the past 50 years or so. I also want to see competitive racing. So I see both sides of the argument, and I think this Preakness, it is what it is, and we don't have to spend too much time handicapping it, I think, because it's just not the most interesting race. But through that lens, I guess we can start to talk about some of the contenders.
Yeah, the only thing I'll add, if you want to make the Preakness a better race, then the schedule is going to have to change, because horsemen have obviously shown they're not going to change. Their change has been to move away from the Preakness. It seems like horses who don't win the Derby, for the most part, are just taking their ball and going home and regrouping. And I get that part of it too. What it's going to come down to is, are the people at Pimlico happy with the Preakness? Isn't it making money for them the way they want it to? Is the field affecting their bottom line? Because if it is, I imagine they'll campaign for a change and try to help their race. If it isn't, then they're going to be happy right where they are, because the one thing, unless this changes, and we saw it last year, but I don't think it was a trend, is the Preakness is almost always going to have the Derby winner. So it's going to be a show where it is, and Belmont's more than happy where they are. They probably like this trend with the Preakness because they're going to get more and more shots at the Triple Crown. The Belmont has the obviously ridiculously strong undercard to support it in years where there's not a horse going for the Triple Crown. So would you say the Preakness is the one race that has kind of taken the brunt of things and really lost some luster? And being from Baltimore, I hate to say that. I mean, it used to be the Preakness was, you would get the top 3-4 horses from the Derby, a couple others that maybe had tough trips or excuses. Everybody wanted to win the Preakness, but sadly, it just doesn't seem that way anymore. It's just kind of become just another grade 1.
Yeah, it's become a little bit of an afterthought, frankly, in the schedule. I mean, a lot of connections are just hell-bent on pointing to the Derby and not really thinking about, any other goals after that. And after the Derby, which can be a hard race in a lot of horses, they're just content to sit it out and wait for targets later in the year. And I'm not one of these people that thinks that the Triple Crown has to be successful for horse racing to be successful. I know that there are some people who hold that point of view, and that's not me. I mean, if we're comfortable with the Triple Crown sort of becoming less important, okay, that's fine. I mean, if we'll have competitive racing later in the year. I mean, if the people want to point to the Travers after the Kentucky Derby, and that's part of the new elite schedule for 3-year-olds, then sure. But it seems like a lot of people really do want to hold on to the Triple Crown, and I don't think you can hold both things in your hands at the same time. The current schedule and also having the Triple Crown be flourishing. So. We'll see how it plays out, but I mean, clearly it's something that people still have some mixed feelings about. I didn't want to spend too much time on that, and I probably spent more time than I really wanted to, since we've been talking about it plenty already. Let's get into handicapping this race, and we'll begin from the rail out with the number 1 National Treasure, who we've already talked about a little bit with regard to the pace scenario. This is a horse who obviously started out with Bob Baffert, was switched into the barn of Tim Yakteen to potentially collect some Derby qualifying points in the Santa Anita Derby, but given that did not work out, he's now back with Bob Baffert, running in the Preakness. And, Craig, this is a horse that showed a lot of talent as a 2-year-old, was pretty precocious, placing in the American Pharaoh and the Breeders' Cup Juvenile. I think it's debatable whether he's moved forward at all as a 3-year-old, based on speed figures. The answer is probably not really. But he's still coming in with figs that make him a major player in here if you think that the trip's going to work out for him.
Yeah, I guess I'm skeptical of National Treasure, to be honest. The figures are okay; they fit with others. Maybe not Mage's Derby, but they're right there with what we saw from First Mission. I just am really skeptical of the California races. Unfortunately, we didn't get to see Practical Move or Skinner in the Derby, as both were scratches with supposedly minor things, but it wasn't minor enough that they showed up in the Preakness, which another thing that kind of surprised me. But Mandarin Hero didn't show up. Maybe that was a bounce thing. We've seen horses run well and coming over first over from overseas and not really duplicated the second time. But when you look through these the horses that he's been in against, it just isn't anything to get all that excited about. So I'm not really going to rely on National Treasure very much. I do think they're going to try to go for the lead, as I mentioned. I'm not sure he's fast enough to get there, but I also just don't think he's good enough if he does get there to finish out the race.
Yeah, I mean, he had maybe minor trouble, and I say that meaning very minor trouble, in both the Sham and the Santa Anita Derby. I mean, arguably, he didn't really have a clear path to the top of the stretch in the Sham before angling out, but didn't finish off that race maybe the way you'd want to see when he did get into the clear. And then in the Santa Anita Derby, he was trying to make his move at the quarter pole, but Skinner just ran right by him when he was making that blitz on the far turn. And National Treasure did briefly have to pause and come around that foe, but he was only making a mild impression at the very end of that race. So I don't want to upgrade him too much off of those perceived trouble lines. And I have some questions about whether stretching out a little further is really going to suit him, just given his pedigree and the way he looks. He's not the biggest horse, and he strikes me as one that might ultimately want to go a little bit shorter than this. I will say, watching his recent training on XBTV, Bob Baffert has really been drilling this horse in the morning. I mean, he's been working solo, but he's been getting asked to achieve those times, and has been responding to the exercised rider's pressure. But I mean, he really getting fit for this race, I guess is the way that I'll put it. Whether that's enough for him to make an impact against this field, and Mage, who was the Derby winner, I think it remains to be seen. Like you, I'm a little skeptical of both his overall quality and how much upside is really left for a horse that seemed like he was already doing most of his developing last year. So he's not going to be for me in this race, but I understand the case that some might be making for him. Let's move on to number 2, Chase the Chaos, and he is probably the outsider in this field, if there is one. He has never been successful on the dirt, has been achieving his best results on the synthetic recently at Golden Gate, and last time out, not even that, because he put in a pretty disappointing performance. Kind of surprising that they're coming back here for a race like the Preakness. Just seems like a horse that has a lot to prove, to say the least.
Yeah, I mean, he gets a free entry because he won the El Camino Real Derby. Why that's tied to a Triple Crown race is because of the ownership, because it's obviously run on a different surface. His dirt races have not been good to say the least. His maiden race, I guess you could say, looks okay on paper, but he got a 63 Timeform US speed figure that day in an off the turf muddy track. So yeah, I don't want to spend too much time talking about a horse that I just think has absolutely zero chance.
Move on to the Kentucky Derby winner, Mage, the upset winner of that race, going off at 15-1. And Craig, the more that I look at this horse, the more I'm kind of scratching my head as to how this horse, could have gone off at 15-1 without me thinking that he was a contender in that race. But hindsight's always 20/20 with these things because, this horse did run really well in the Florida Derby. We had talked about it in the lead up to the Kentucky Derby, even though we kind of let the history of these lightly raced horses maybe get into our heads a little too much. But there's no denying that Mage is very talented, and things just worked out perfectly for him on Derby Day. He broke slowly, like he always does, or at least like he has done in the last three starts. But Javier Castellano was ready for it, got him right over to the rail, sat off a very hot early pace, was able to advance at the right point, and Javier just rode him like he knew he was on the best horse, and maybe he was, as he was able to collar two fills who had done a lot of hard work in the early stages of that race, but Mage ran by him at the eighth pole and was able to hold on for the victory. You could talk about the speed figure, Craig. It came back very fast for this class of 3-year-olds. If you believe the Derby Timeform US speed figure or even the buyer number, it suggests that a lot of these horses improved on Derby Day, which is certainly a possibility. And if Mage runs back to that number, he's going to be really tough for this field to beat.
He is, and generally Derby winners tend to run back to their numbers in the when they show up in the Preakness. I wouldn't be surprised at all if he did. He's obviously very talented. I remember that Florida Derby. We talked about it on our Derby preview. That move he made to the lead was not just a move to the lead. It was eye-catching, I think is what I said that day. I wasn't smart enough to use him because of the lightly race thing, but he's clearly very talented. Obviously the horse to beat. He's not going to be 8-5 like they show in the morning line. I mean, this horse got to be 3-5, right?
Yeah, I had to do a DRF morning line for this race, which is on our DRF Preakness page, and I made him even money on my line. It just feels like this is a race where he has to be a short price. Like you said, I mean, unless we see some phenomenon like last year where the long shots are going off at 12-1, I'm not sure that's going to happen in the aftermath of this Derby like it did in the aftermath of Rich Strike's Derby. I mean, that might inflate Mage's price and the prices on the short prices a little bit, but I'm not anticipating we're going to see that phenomenon, present itself to quite that same degree. So I agree. We're on the same page about that. I think Mage is going to be pretty short, and he deserves to be short in this race. And obviously the 2-week turnaround is the thing that you might want to be concerned about. As you said, over time, we've generally seen horses that run well in the Derby come back and also run well in the Preakness, which makes it all the more perplexing that a lot of connections don't decide to run back in the Preakness after their horses have run so well in the Kentucky Derby. But Mage is the only one that's doing so. And, Craig, I was looking up some stats in Formulator that are specific to his trainer, Gustavo Delgado, and this is a trainer who does very well with quick turnarounds, and you can't say that for every trainer, especially not a lot of these super trainers that don't like to run their horses back on short rest. Gustavo Delgado off 1 to 20 day layoffs on the dirt. He's 31 for 134. That's a 23% win rate with a $2.22 ROI in that 134 horse sample, and specifically in horses running back in 20 days or less with that won their last races on the dirt. He's 8 for 23, 35% with a $2.39 ROI. So this barn has experience running horses back that are in good form on short rest. So maybe that's reason to be a little bit less concerned about this with Mage. They haven't done a whole lot with him in the interim between the Derby and the Preakness, no timed workouts. I watched a video that the Maryland Racing put out of him on the track the other day, and he looked great. He looked fresh for the race. So just feel like Mage is the most likely winner, and I don't have a really clever take on him. He's just very much the horse to beat in here.
He is. Maybe there's some concern about his slow starts. Given the pace scenario, I'm not even sure that's that big of a concern if he comes out a jumper too slow because I don't think it's going to get super hot up front. I think he can get a good position regardless, and I fully expect him to run his race. And you adding those statistics from Formulator certainly doesn't change my view there.
Yeah, and just to touch upon what you said about the slow start, I mean, possibly if this pace is a little slower and the field gets really bunched up, sort of like it did last year in that Preakness won by early voting, where Epicenter was maybe a little sluggish in the early stages, and he wound up towards the back of the pack, where I think a lot of people did not project him to be there. I suppose there's the possibility that if Mage breaks very slowly, like he did in the Florida Derby, let's say, because his Derby break wasn't even that bad, but if he breaks as slowly as he did in the Florida Derby, perhaps there's a scenario where he gets locked inside at the back of the pack and has to pass everybody. He might be talented enough to do so, but I guess at a very short price, that's my biggest concern with him, that he might be left with too much to do or have to deal with some sort of traffic trouble in a slower paced situation than last time. On the other hand, he's a very handy horse, like you were saying. He's got that big turn of foot, so I kind of have some confidence that he might be able to get himself out of that kind of trouble, even if it presents itself. But you do have to decide how short a price you want to take on a horse where that is possible. Let's move on to the number 4, Coffee with Chris, another one of the long shots in this race. And, Craig, this is not a bad horse. He's run some nice speed figures. He runs frequently, so I'm not, too concerned. He definitely has an experience edge on a lot of these. I'm not sure this is the right race for him. A mile and 3/16 feels like it's really a stretch, and even though this isn't the strongest Preakness that we've ever seen, to say the least, I mean, the company here is definitely stronger than what he's been facing. I don't want to take anything away from him. Like I said, he's a good horse, just probably not the right race.
Yeah, we previewed him when we did the Long Branch last week, which he obviously scratched out of, and we had distance concerns for that race, and now he's going a furlong further here. So, yeah, he's not for me. I think, like I said, I won't be surprised at all if he's on the lead. He's the one I would pick. He just has that high natural speed. You can see a lot of red fractions in his PPs, but he's not the gamest horse in the stretch, so more of a pace factor for me than he is a win contender or even exotics for that matter.
The number 5 is Red Route 1, and he is a horse that didn't quite get enough points to make it into the Derby field, so they instead ran him a week before the Derby, or a little more than a week before the Derby, in that Bathhouse Row Stakes at Oaklawn Park last time, coming back just 3 weeks after he put in a slightly disappointing effort in the Arkansas Derby, and he did win that last race, Craig. It was the first time he was racing on Lasix, which will have to come off here, so maybe take that for what you believe it's worth. But this is a horse that had run well in prior starts without LASIK, so I'm not really too worried about that. And he got the job done last time. He did receive a very favorable pace scenario in that stakes at Oaklawn, as they were really moving up front, and he was far off the pace like he always is, but was able to take advantage of that setup. He's just going to have to get faster if you consider him a win candidate in this race, but he's definitely one that I will not be surprised when he comes clunking along at the end for a piece.
Yeah, I could see that. He's had very favorable setups. The 2 races of his last 3 that he's run well, the Rebel and that Bathhouse Row Stakes. He just drops right off the screen when they come out, even with the addition of blinkers. He just doesn't have any early speed whatsoever, and it seems like that's going to be a real detriment in a race that I don't think is going to be particularly quick. It's rare for a Triple Crown race, at least the Derby or the Preakness, not to have that fast pace flag, but this one didn't even come close to it. If I were going to use him, it would be for like the 3rd and 4th slots.
Yeah, and I mean, I do think he's a good horse, and, he's not the kind of horse that I would typically be at all interested in the Preakness, but this did not come up a strong Preakness, and I've got some negative takes on quite a few others in here. So I do sort of by default have to upgrade Red Route 1 a little bit, because I do think he's going to run well in this race for him, and I think that might be good enough to at least get into the trifecta here. We'll see how the pace plays out. Like you said, he's taken advantage of some favorable setups in the past, but I mean, aside from that Arkansas Derby, where when I watched it back, it wasn't even as bad as I remembered. I mean, he was really running at the end and only lost second by a length that day, having to alter course a few times. He's a horse that just typically shows up, and I think he's going to show up once again. I do wonder if maybe Steve Asmussen is thinking long term. Maybe this is a horse that might be better suited to the Belmont Stakes than the Preakness, so we'll run here, but maybe have a better chance in 3 weeks. We'll see how that all plays out. But in terms of exotics, he's definitely one that's on my radar.
Yeah, I look forward to discussing that. These deep closers run well in the Belmont thing. That trainer seems to like to latch onto, because every year it never plays out, and then we go right back to it the next year. But yeah, I agree with you. He's fine. I'm not worried about the Lasix. As you said, he's run similar speed figures off of the Lasix. He hasn't really progressed forward. That's a concern for me a bit, but maybe some of that's because of his running style.
Up next is the number 6, Perform. He is coming off 2 consecutive victories, having just broken his maiden 2 back, and then last time out coming back off that maiden victory to win the local prep for this, the Federico Tessio at Laurel. And, Craig, we talked about this race a little bit last week when we were, mentioning some horses that ran back out of it, or rather just one of them, because Coffee with Chris, who's also out of that race, is running in the Preakness instead. But we did see the runner-up, 90% Maddie, come back in the long branch, and maybe a little disappointing in that race. I know that he and Coffee with Chris had gotten a big pace upgrade for the fast pace that Perform took advantage of in the Federico Tessio. So maybe you want to talk a little bit about that, about why Coffee with Chris in TimeformUS has a much higher speed figure for that Federico Tessio than Perform does, even though Perform was first and Coffee with Chris was fifth. But it did seem like a race where the pace had a major impact on the result.
Yeah, the figures are different because of the pace. All the fractions were in red right up to the finish. And that's the main reason Coffee with Chris got that pace upgrade. I will say, I did watch this race live, and the way Perform was able to, despite a troubled trip early, little trouble at the start, finish off that race was impressive. The concern for me is he just hasn't been that fast. His best TimeformUS speed figure is a 103. Compared that with a horse like Mage, who ran 124 in the Derby, or even other horses who have run 117s in their last race. He's still got a long way to go. We had to send in our picks for DRF on Monday. If I had to do it over again, I would probably put Perform fourth. I left him out, but now that I think about it, watching that race, maybe I would change that. Just being Shug McGahee, he doesn't often point horses to races like this if he doesn't think they're going to run well. So maybe you could give him a little bit of an upgrade, but I still think the exacta would be a major accomplishment. It's just hard for me to envision.
Yeah, I mean, we did see another horse that was closing late in that Federico Tessio come back and run in the Peter Pan. That was third place finisher Summer Cause, who was only beaten a length and a quarter by Perform and arguably had a better trip. But I mean, he lost the Peter Pan by 15 lengths. So I think you really do have to call into question just the overall strength of that Federico Tessio. And, I get it. I mean, Perform was visually impressive, knifing his way through the pack to win that race. And there were a couple points where Fergal Lynch had to sort of pause on him and alter course. And, people get all excited when they see that horse have trouble in the late stage and then get up to win at the end. But it was such an accordion race where, the whole field came together at the very end. And, if you just watch him, not in, in comparison to 90% Maddie and Coffee with Chris, and rather comparing him to other closers in the race, he basically, made up 2 lengths on the other closers. It's not like he was closing at a much faster rate than anybody else. So I have mixed feelings about how good Perform really is, and going out for the connections that he's going out for. I won't be surprised if he's a similar price to Red Route 1, and personally, I think Red Route 1 is much, much, much more likely to be effective in this race than Perform is. Let's move on to Blazing Sevens, who is drawn in post position 7. And he is making his third start off the layoff here. He was a good 2-year-old last year, winning the Champagne in a bit of an upset and then finishing 4th behind Forte and National Treasure in the Breeders' Cup Juvenile. Obviously a massive disappointment when he was basically totally uncompetitive off the layoff in the Fountain of Youth. He did bounce back with a better effort last time in the Bluegrass. Still not an effort that makes me want to get too excited about him in this race, but maybe if you're projecting improvement again now, 3rd off the layoff, he's a horse that some people might want to get interested in. And also, there is that factor of Chad Brown a couple times in recent years, skipping the Derby with cloud computing and early voting and then winning the Preakness. And now maybe that's becoming an angle in people's minds, and Blazing Seven certainly fits that, though he's a different kind of horse than both cloud computing and early voting, who were late developers that sort of only ran as 3-year-olds. Blazing Seven's just sort of trying to get back to better races from last year.
Yeah, I don't consider him the same as those. I'll just from the start, I picked him 3rd in this race when I sent my picks in, and I'm fine with that. And it was based on the reason that you said. I'm expecting an improved race. Obviously, the Fountain of Youth was a complete no-show. I'm putting a line through that one. And I thought he ran okay last time in that Bluegrass. He ran a decent 3rd. His speed figure got back to his 2-year-old level. I don't think it was the greatest trip. The pace was solid. It wasn't fast. None of the fractions are coded in red, but he was very wide around the first turn, which is never a good thing. Not surprising from the 8 post, but I thought he did okay to hold on and run 3rd there. So I'm expecting another forward move. I wouldn't be surprised if this horse ran a 115 in the Preakness off that 107 last time. And it just feels like in this race that would be good enough to hit the board.
Does it bother you at all that nobody from the Bluegrass came back and ran well in the Kentucky Derby? Arguably, there were some trips in there. Verifying got caught up in that very fast pace that he was actually setting. And Tapit Trice is just Tapit Trice. I mean, we knew that was possible, that he might not react well to the Derby situation. But is that a little bit of a concern that maybe the Bluegrass just wasn't that strong a race overall?
I mean, not really, because it didn't look that strong number-wise. I mean, the top 2 ran 115s that day, when Tapit Trice ran a 113 in the Derby, with a little bit of trouble, I guess you could say. So I don't think he really regressed so much as just ran his race and wasn't good enough. Like I said, I'm not picking Blazing Sevens to win. I just expect a forward move off that 108 since it kind of matched his 2-year-old race, and I think that could be good enough in a weak field to get him into the trifecta.
Yeah, I have some concerns about this horse going longer distances. I mean, just the way that he's run a few of his races, particularly last time in the Bluegrass. I mean, he travels really well and then gets set down and sort of doesn't find more. And to me, that sometimes is indicative of a horse that wants to go a little bit shorter. Maybe he's racing into fitness. I mean, I guess that's another explanation for it. But we'll see which is true on Saturday. I'm skeptical of this horse, and I feel like he's going to take some money in this race just based on that perception that Chad Brown has found the key to winning the Preakness. I don't know if this horse really fits that mold, but we'll see what price he is.
I'd agree with the winning part. The one thing I wish Trackus was still around, because I'd love to see his Trackus numbers from the Bluegrass.
Yes, it would be nice to get ground loss data this day and age, and something that we're not getting anymore. So maybe we'll be able to get to that point of technological advancement again at some point. Moving on to the last horse that we'll talk about in this Preakness field, drawn on the far outside, the number 8, First Mission, the Brad Cox representative in this field. Like Mage, he's very lightly raced, although he was never really on the Triple Crown trail. He was just a very late developer, only breaking his maiden in the middle of March. Came back and won the Lexington as the favorite, but again, I mean, never really pointing towards the Kentucky Derby. Beat a good horse that day, an Arabian Lion, who really did everything his own way up on the front end in that Lexington, and I think you do want to give First Mission some credit for running that horse down and doing so by coming through on the rail. I thought he showed a lot of likable attributes in that race. Here's my worry with First Mission, Craig. It's that I think he has to improve a little bit to beat Mage, and he's just coming into this Preakness as everyone's obvious alternative to the favorite. So I kind of I worry that he's going to be a very unappealing price in this race.
Yeah, I worry about that. I'll be upfront. I picked this horse on top because I think he is the second most likely winner, and I think he's going to be 4 times the price of Mage. I think he'll probably be around that morning line. If he dropped down to like an 85 second choice, then I'm not going to be interested. But I like everything I've seen from this horse so far. He lost his debut to Bishop's Bay, but I thought he might have been the best horse that day when he came from off a slow pace and nearly got to the horse at the wire. And his last two have been very impressive. I like the Lexington. We saw Disarm come out to run a very good race in the Derby out of that Lexington. So I think the speed figure is totally legit. Still needs to take a step forward, but I think he will. And the main reason I picked him is just because of the pace scenario. I think he's a horse who's going to be right up on the front. I don't think the pace is going to be quick. And he's a horse who's shown he can finish off his races. Do I think he's going to win? No. I would say Mage is probably 40, 50, maybe greater than 50% to win, but I think he's going to be bet heavier than that. And I would say the majority of the rest would go to First Mission, and perhaps there'll be a little bit of no overlay. It doesn't sound like you think that, and it's possible. I really don't know. I think people might go a little overboard on Mage.
Yeah, I mean, I'll be interested to see how this race is bet. It's kind of funny you brought up that because I was just, before we did this, I was working on my fair odds line for the Preakness, which I'll put out like I did for the Derby and, write a little article on that. And I kind of pegged them exactly where you said. I think Mage is about, a little more than 40% to win this Preakness. And I have First Mission about 25%. I think it's, a good 65 to 70% chance that one of these two horses is going to win the race. And to me, I wouldn't want to take much lower than 3-1, 5-2 on First Mission, and I wouldn't want to take much lower than 7-5 on Mage. So we'll see how it gets bet. But as I kind of went through making my value line for this race, I'll sort of give away my thesis here. It's that this is just not an appealing betting race. And it's one of those races where I ended up where nobody is really offering good value. So in that situation, I'm just going to pick the horse that I think is most likely to win. I'm not going to try to make something happen in a race that I'm not that excited about betting. And, I have no problem with putting First Mission on top. I think he's, far and away the second most likely horse to win this race. And I think if Mage gets upset, it's very likely to be First Mission. I guess I wasn't anticipating that there'd be a huge gap between them in the prices. But again, it's one of those situations where I'm going to want to see how it's bet. And maybe that'll make it clearer that there's a wager I did not initially foresee. But the way that I'm sort of drawing things up right now, this is just a Preakness that I'm not that interested in playing.
And I think you kind of came full circle with where we started when we talked about the Preakness. It's disappointing, the field that we drew here. It's not a great betting race. I made picks because we have to make picks for DRF. It doesn't necessarily mean that I'm going to bet the race, which is kind of sad. Hopefully we can reverse that trend and see some stronger Preaknesses going forward. Maybe the weak field will encourage next year some other horses' connections to give it a try. But it sure doesn't seem that's the trend. And when we're talking about the second jewel of the Triple Crown, it really is a little depressing, to be honest, to talk about a race that isn't all that interesting betting wise, because we don't get that many big races that we're interested in betting outside the Breeders' Cup and the Derby. And unfortunately, it's just the way racing's gone. A lot of Grade 1 top races have small fields and heavy favorites. And unfortunately, that's what we're getting in the Preakness, something that didn't used to be that way in the past.
Yeah, and I mean, I think the point that I want to make, just to build on what you're saying, is it didn't used to be that way in Derbies won by a 15-1 shot. Because, a lot of people will point out that there have been plenty of Preaknesses in the past that were really uninteresting. I mean, I remember that field that lined up against American Pharaoh was pretty comparable to this one. You could say the same thing about the field that Big Brown beat back in 2008. I mean, those were not vintage editions of the Preakness, but those were both horses that looked formidable coming into the Kentucky Derby and won it as the favorite, and sort of everybody who thought that they might try to beat them in the Derby realized, we can't do it. Mage was 15-1 coming into the Derby, and maybe he should have been a shorter price than that. That's I think that's all a fair argument. But typically we don't see Derbies that have such a competitive result, just completely fall apart with the Preakness. So I wanted to make that clarification. I mean, it's a little unusual in this situation to see a Preakness just sort of get handed to the Derby winner the way that it seems to be here. But the upside of that, Craig, is it does increase the chances that we could get a Triple Crown attempt in 3 weeks. And, even the biggest curmudgeon in the sport can appreciate a Triple Crown attempt.
Yeah, it's funny, and I don't want to contradict you, but just this is kind of a Timeform US advertisement while you were talking about it. I pulled up the American Pharaoh race, and actually the 2, 3, and 5 finishers from that Derby were in Baltimore.
I stand corrected. Maybe
Yeah.
I'm thinking of the California Chrome. I don't know. I mean, I remember one of those
Yeah, there
Preaknesses
have
from
been weak ones for
yes. I mean,
sure.
there've definitely been some pretty sorry Preaknesses in the past, but we agree, Craig. I mean, this one is definitely up there. There's no getting around that fact. So it sounds like we're landing at a pretty similar place here, even though we have slightly different picks on top. And we've kind of already alluded to it, Craig. But I'll just say my picks in this race are 3, 8, 5, 1. I put Mage over First Mission with Red Route 1 in third and National Treasure in fourth. And I acknowledge it's just not a particularly clever take on this race.
No, and usually a race like this, if I think that the favorite's going to win, or I can find a horse that is going to be a big price underneath, but Blazing Sevens, I put him third. He's not going to be much of a price. He's 6-1 on the morning line. Chad Brown, that's not going to happen. Red Route 1, you mentioned. Yeah, sure, he could get in there. He might be 10-1, but that's not the kind of boxcars you're going to need to juice up a price if Mage and First Mission are in there as well. So just hard to get excited about this one. I haven't had a chance to look at the rest of the card. Maybe it could be a leg you lean on heavily going light, playing pick fours and pick fives. I just haven't dug that deep yet.
Well, speaking of the rest of this card, Craig, you and I will be putting out some stakes previews later this week that people can find. I think we'll be doing 3 stakes in total, or 3 videos in total, and including one on the Preakness, where we'll try to condense all of the thoughts that we've laid out on this podcast. In addition to that, I'll be doing betting strategies this week with Dan Illman, who people probably know is very focused on the Maryland circuit, so he'll have some insight, particularly into some of the Laurel-based and Pimlico-based horses. So we'll be doing that. You can find out more about that on DRF.com on the DRF shop page. And, like I did for Derby Day with Marcus Hirsch, we'll be writing analysis of every single race on this Pimlico Saturday card and putting together some wagers. So like I said, you can find out more information about that on DRF.com. And I'm sure we'll be, putting out some other content on social media. I know you said you wrote an article. I'll be writing one too for, the DRF website. So plenty of other Preakness content coming from Greg and I later this week.
Yeah, looking forward to it. I wish I could make it home, but it couldn't work it out this year. It's still going to be a fun day of racing. The Friday card looks good to me as well.
Oh, and I should also mention that, as I'm doing all of these plugs, I'm also doing a webinar with Dan Illman on Thursday evening. I think we'll be focusing primarily on the Preakness. There's a tweet out there that you can, ask some questions of us if you've got specific questions that you want us to answer during the webinar. So just wanted to also not go without mentioning that. And yeah, Craig, I've been to a few Preaknesses in the past. I mean, it's a fun day to try to get to. I don't think I'm going to make it this year, but I'll be watching closely to see how it all plays out, because I definitely will be at the Belmont Stakes in 3 weeks, and the energy is always increased when there's a Triple Crown attempt. So feels like that could be possible this year. I don't want to get ahead of ourselves, but the Preakness is just shaping up that way. So we'll talk about that when we get there, I assume.
Yeah, I'll be rooting for Mage, even if I bet the other horse, because I might try to talk Elsie into coming to the Belmont and hanging out with you, David, if that happens. I haven't been in quite a while. I can't even remember when the last Belmont I went to was. It might have been Real Quiet, who lost, obviously, but Victory Gallop beating Real Quiet.
Well, that would be something to look forward to if we could make it happen, Craig. That'd be really cool. Well, hopefully things all go according to plan on Saturday. We'll see how this all plays out. Everybody, thanks for tuning in to this podcast. You can always check out these TimeformUS podcasts on DRF.com, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube, wherever you get your podcast. Just make sure to subscribe to the Daily Racing Form channel. Like I said at the top, this is the only podcast we'll be putting out this week since we kind of combined the Pacecast and Forecast into this one episode. But Craig and I will be back to our usual schedule next week when we'll be doing our Preakness recap a week from today, next Tuesday. So everybody make sure to tune back in then. Again, thanks for listening this week and good luck at the Preakness on Saturday.